Hello and welcome to Psych 319, Chapter 7, Part 1. We're going to round up the memory chapter in a few short slides, rather the memory section, talking about some more long-term memory. There are many flavors of long-term memory. Earlier we portrayed in the memory systems model that there was just perceptual short-term and long-term memory, and also working memory is a variation of short-term memory. But there are several long-term memory categories, and none of the categories are absolute. Psychology has not really concluded how best to describe learned long-term memory, so the best I can say is that there are several continua, several aspects of memory where some things are very sharply defined and others are, the boundaries are a little more fuzzy. And this includes implicit versus explicit memory, episodic versus semantic, declarative versus procedural, automatic versus intentional, and a lot of these categories are overlapping. So let's see. Yeah, that basically says what I'm going to say. So let's talk about episodic versus semantic memory. So episodic memory is remembering a specific event in your lifetime. So think about a TV episode. If you're remembering an episode of your life, that's an episodic memory. But it can be distinguished from other types of memory, like semantic memory, because semantic memory is more of memorizing facts and figures. So you might remember facts and figures about something you learned, but you might not remember the episode in which you learned it. And by contrast, there are other types of episodes where you might remember the event, but maybe not the content that you learned. Semantic memory, again, is remembering specific facts, like Paris is the capital of France. And so they can be related, but not necessarily, like learning how to ride a bike. You remember the content, the semantic knowledge, like you put your feet on the pedals, and that, bikes have wheels, but you might not have remembered all of the details about every episode of bike riding you've ever had in your life. So again, semantic knowledge is what are the pedals, handlebars, how to signal for a turn. Episodic knowledge, who taught you, how old were you, what you ate for lunch after that, things like that. So there's support for episodic semantic memory systems, rather there's support for those being distinct. Amnesia patients can lose one type of memory system and not the other. So there was a patient who lost the ability to recall his own personal history, but could recall all the basic facts about the world. He seemed to be lose his episodic memory, but not his semantic knowledge. And conversely, there are other patients who have lost the ability to recall basic facts about the world, but they can recall a personal history. Sorry, there's a siren going by outside my apartment. So these types of brain damage seem to support different memory systems. Content being stored in a particular area, and maybe episodes of someone's life being stored somewhere else. So it's not language that's impaired, probably in both of these patients, it's important to notice, but access to specific memories. It's not that they don't have the ability to say the word, but the access to that concept that's being blocked. Another types of distinctions are procedural versus declarative memory. So procedural memory is the knowledge about how to do something, like how do you use a hammer. Okay, so you know how to use a hammer, you know how to use a pencil. Declarative memory is the knowledge about the facts about that. So declarative memory is very similar to semantic memory. Again, so declarative semantic distinction is not very clear. In fact, you can think of them as being the same thing. Procedural memory, of course, is very different from both of those. So procedural and episodic memory are similar, but they also share differences, which I think I'm going to get into the next slide. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little confusing. Let's go back to here. So procedural knowledge, you might remember how to use a hammer, but you might not remember the exact episode in which you learned to use that hammer. So that sort of tells us that procedural and episodic memories are different. You can memorize how you did something but not remember the episode in which you learned how to do that. But for now, you can think of declarative and semantic memories as being similar. They're basically content-based memories. Let me draw another important distinction between implicit and explicit memories. So explicit memories are memories that you can consciously access. Implicit memories affect your behavior, but you're not consciously aware of them. They're things that you learned along the way, so to speak. Procedural memories are somewhat implicit. So when you learn how to do something, there are a lot of things and information that you acquire with that procedural knowledge that you may not have conscious access to. And then maybe upon further reflection, you might say, oh yeah, I guess I do know how to do that. Maybe think about things like skills that you acquire when you're learning how to drive a car, or something that requires a lot of practice. Eventually you sort of get some type of information for free once you've practiced up on that procedure. Different types of memories might be more implicit or explicit. So declarative and semantic and episodic memories are more explicit. These are things that you're consciously aware of. You're aware of the facts. You're aware of particular episodes in your life. So that makes them explicit. A lot of procedural knowledge tends to be implicit. When you do learn something, like I mentioned before, you tend not to think about the details or the facts associated with that. You just sort of know how to do something. Evidence for implicit versus explicit memory systems. A lot of it comes from patients. If you drink too much and you have a genetic disposition for this disease, you can get Korsakoff syndrome. And Korsakoff syndrome is kind of like having a bilateral surgery of the hippocampus, where you have your hippocampus removed. It causes a complete loss of short-term memory. So Korsakoff's patients can learn fear responses. I'm sorry, there's just so many sirens going on outside my window. It's very distracting. Korsakoff's patients can demonstrate other types of learning. They can learn conditioned fear responses, but they will forget the actual episode of the training. There's evidence to separate implicit versus explicit memory systems from repetition priming. So semantic priming is when certain words facilitate access or to related words. So for example, doctor primes nurse. If you hear the word doctor, oftentimes the next word a person is asked for will be nurse. If I say the word peanut butter, the first word that probably pops into your head is jelly, because peanut butter primes jelly. They're frequently associated and they have related meanings and purposes. So amnesics show evidence of repetition priming even if they can't remember the training. So you can take a person with amnesia or Korsakoff syndrome and train them up on a bunch of words. They will show evidence of repetition priming, which means that they have implicit memory. They've learned something, even though they can't remember the episode or the training. So they lack the explicit knowledge, but they do implicitly require the information that facilitates priming. So both of these examples show implicit learning in the absence of explicit memories. So another process is another distinction is the automatic versus intentional processes. Let me get to the gist here. Okay, yeah. So a lot of this is informed by what we know recently from neuroanatomy and what we've learned from particular patient studies of people with brain disorders. But first I want to remember that the neocortex is this outer layer of the brain. It contains gray matter, and the cell bodies of your brain are located in the neocortex. And it's typically used for learning things. The neocortex is used for a lot of stuff, but when you're learning a new skill, you're really using the neocortex quite a bit. But when a process becomes automatic, there's an internal structure called the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia sort of take over. They sort of take over automated tasks. So when you're learning how to drive a car, for example, the first time you're learning, everything is different. You're trying to coordinate multiple systems, and you're using your neocortex. It's very intentional. It's an intentional process. It requires a lot of effort. But once you've learned how to do that, then the basal ganglia take over, and you can do simple things like make a decision to turn left, and the basal ganglia will take over all the automatic functions like turning the wheel, pressing in the clutch, using the gears, and so on and so forth. So you don't have to think about each one separately. So automatic processes provide access to memories that don't require effort. Intentional processes provide access to memories, but it requires attention. And this evidence comes again from patients with Parkinson's. So if you have a patient with Parkinson's disease, what tends to happen is their basal ganglia get damaged and they lose those automatic processes. So things have, when you watch a patient with Parkinson's try and sit in a chair, it's not that they lack the musculature to sit in the chair. They lack the basal ganglia that would allow them to execute that process automatically. So every aspect of sitting in the chair becomes an intentional memory process. They have to remember to bend their legs, put their hand on the arm of the chair to stabilize themselves, and so on and so forth.